Welcome everyone to this talk about information design. We're very happy to have you here, Angela. Angela, she's an information designer, and she's here because we are having a course in science communication where we are trying to teach scientists how to be better at communicating their research, and a lot of you are here now. So I guess I'll just, the stage is yours.
Hello. I can see many familiar faces. So, my name is Angela Morelli, and I am an information designer. I actually have a background in engineering, and then I kind of moved from engineering into industrial design, and then I specialized in information design at Central St. Martin's. And now I am based in Norway, and this is how my professional life... Oh, we are not on, I think. Yeah, this is how my professional life is roughly organized. I spend 50% of my time working with scientists at the Norwegian Knowledge Centre for Health Services in Oslo. I work 25% of my time on self-initiated projects on usually environmental and social issues. And I spend 25% of my time teaching and running workshops in information design and data visualization with Tom Gabriel Johansen in organizations and universities. And participants are designers, non-designers, journalists, activists, scientists, people who would like to acquire tools to communicate data more effectively. Tom and me are the co-founders of a platform that is called Info Design Lab, and one of the aims is to share our experiences in working with scientists and experts, or any individual who needs to turn complex information into meaningful narratives, beautiful visions, and understandable messages, namely in data stories. Now, data visualization is often promoted for its ability to reveal stories within data. But these data stories differ from traditional forms of storytelling. So in the next 45 minutes, I would like to share with you some of the lessons that I've learned along my journeys of visualizing data in order to build good data stories. We are all aware of the importance of stories. Architect and information designer Richard Saul-Wurman says that the point is that stories permit information to be imprinted into memory. They encourage the application of information, and that is what gives it meaning. But why is that? I got interested not only in how to tell a story with data, but in why stories can be so powerful. So, Science Podcast Radio Lab is one of my favorite podcasts. In summer 2013, I was on a very hot train traveling the very south of Italy, and I was listening to an episode that is called Placebo. The two hosts, Robert and Jad, were talking to each other, and Robert says to Jad, "I will tell you a story about telling stories." And this is the story. It is a story about a guy who is the father of placebo effect, a German guy, Henry Beecher. He is a doctor during the World War II, and he finds himself in the Great Battle of Anzio when Americans landed in Nazi Europe. Soldiers were being killed and some were being wounded, and Henry Beecher's job was to treat the soldiers. The treatment at that time for pain, as it's still nowadays, was morphine. There was a problem, because Beecher's division became very low on supplies of morphine, and he had to figure out which soldiers needed it most. So Beecher is talking to the soldiers, and he's asking them how much pain they are actually having. So he would go there and ask, "Soldier, as you lay there, are you having any pain?" Now, imagine you are a soldier, you have a wound in your gut, and you haven't had any morphine for 7 hours. What would you say? you would probably say, "Give me some morphine, I am in pain." The striking fact was that 75% were saying, "No, no, doctor, I am okay. I don't need any morphine right now." 3/4 of them said that. Now, Dr. Beecher knew a lot about pain because he ran a clinic in Boston and where he would see people with wound injuries and gut injuries, more or less the same kind of injuries he saw on the battlefield. But back in Boston, those injuries really hurt. And he had desperate people asking for more morphine. For some strange reason, the intensity of the pain associated with being shot was lower in the battlefield than in civilian life. But what can explain that? Let's listen to what Robert and Jad says.
Maybe soldiers are they're tough guys. They suck it up. They don't.
Well,
no.
Context. That was Beecher's very simple explanation.
Context.
Meaning that the pain that you feel when you're hit by a bullet, it's not just about the bullet. It's just as much about the story that comes with the bullet. So consider these two different stories. Story number one, you are a soldier and you've been shot. As the bullet passes through you, the first thing you think is, "Oh man, I'm shot."
The second thing you think is,
"Wait a second, I'm alive.
if I can be evacuated from here, I'll have a period of recuperation.
They'll take me to a hospital, there'll be nurses there.
I may get a medal
And a pension.
or a bonus. I'll certainly be acclaimed.
They'll send me home, throw me a parade."
I'll be a hero.
Now consider the civilian story. This time you're a regular guy, civilian in Boston. Maybe you own a shop.
Can I help you, sir?
This is a stick-up. Give me your money.
Oh my God, no!
And you've been shot. As the bullet passes through you, this time the thoughts flashing through your head have nothing to do with glory.
That's right.
Instead you think, "Yeah, I'm alive, but what's going to happen to me now?
You wouldn't get a medal. You were in trouble.
How am I going to pay the doctor bills?
Going to be out of
I'm
commission.
going to lose my job. How do I pay the rent?"
And if your family was depending upon you, they suffered.
Nothing good is going to come of this. One bullet, two very different stories. And it's the difference in the stories, said Dr. Beecher, that explains the difference in the experience of pain.
Those stories you're saying are somehow filtering the pain even before it's felt?
Yeah.
That even as the bullet enters the skin,
Right away,
or within seconds thereafter,
you spin yourself a story about what's going to happen to you next. Not consciously, but way down deep in your head. And the story you tell, that makes all the difference.
scientists currently view our whole identity as something that we construct one fraction of a second to another. You are the unfolding of an ongoing narrative. But it's not just a narrative in words. It's a narrative that involves touch, color, odors. We use all those inputs to generate the next frame from the last frame.
So, and I thought this was both very entertaining and incredibly interesting. And basically, we are stories. We think in stories, and we understand through stories. And scientists actually explain why. And one of these scientists is Daniel Kahneman. Many of you might know his name. And in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, you can find some very good research about how we think and about how we tell ourselves stories that influence our decisions. And these stories can be even more powerful than any scientific evidence. And we mentioned that in the talks this morning. But what makes a story? Mandy McAdams, who is a journalism teacher, says that a story moves along an arc. If it's flat, if it's just a sequence of events, it does not have the shape of a story. The shape is the shape of a mountain on which we travel upwards. So the story brings us up to the mountain, and when we reach the top, there has to be something up there that made the journey worthwhile. The story must start with something that makes us want to go up. That's the open. And then the story has to have the power to keep us moving up. In order to convince us to move up, it is important to hook the reader. And we do that by creating visual hooks or by sparking a process of question and answers, until our reader gets to the top. And the top of the mountain is the climax of the story. Ira Glass calls this moment a moment of reflection. But the end is not that, because we should not cut the readers off suddenly. We should not throw them off the summit. We need to make sure that we leave the readers with a sense of satisfaction and a feeling of conclusion. So, clear takeaways. So storytelling is a lot about guiding the climber up and down the mountain. It is about guiding someone through the experience of listening to the story. That's why I like thinking that it's not just about storytelling, but also about story listening. The concept of storytelling is teller-centric. The concept of story listening is listener-centric. So the focus should be on those who listen and on how to construct the listening experience in their heads. So it's not about the teller's journey of telling the story, but about the listener's journey of hearing that story and navigating it. So suddenly storytelling is successful when story listening is achieved. So we can think of data visualizations as narratives that unfold through sequences of data points. Each data point, each flag, is a piece of the story you want to tell, and the narrative is the way you connect the dots. The story is the sequence of events, and the narrative is how the events are told. So if you connect the data points in one way, of course you will end up with a particular kind of narrative. If you connect them in a different way, you end up with a different narrative. A data visualization can be seen as a journey that we offer to the viewers, and during this journey, we can set the path in different ways. We can let the audience discover the path, or we can indicate a direction very, very clearly. And it is important to understand what kind of journey we are offering to the listener and how the journey will be embraced and experienced by the users. Because this journey can be designed very, very consciously and accurately. Whether it is a book, whether it is a poster, whether it is an interactive piece of data visualization. And an interesting paper, Narrative Visualization, Telling Stories with Data, presents some very interesting insights that became extremely useful in my practice to be more conscious about how to build narratives. The authors basically gathered 100 examples of data visualizations from sources such as blogs and books and research and some online journalism. The primary source was online journalism like New York Times and The Guardian and Washington Post. And they found that the examples can be characterized by 7 basic genres, magazine style, annotated chart, partition poster, flowchart, comic strip, slideshow, and video animation. Now, these genres vary in terms of 2 variables. The number of frames, for example, an image that is embedded in a magazine style has just 1 frame, but a comic strip has different frames. The ordering of the visual elements is the second variable. So a partition poster may suggest only a loose order of the images, but the animation has a very strict linear path. Now, both messaging and interactivity can be layered on top of this genre. So, messaging is the use of text to provide observation and explanation about the images, and typically this text takes familiar forms such as headlines, captions, labels, and these are extremely key points that when you design a piece, you have to be very conscious of. Interactivity allows the visualization to be manipulated by the viewer. So interactivity might engage the users, but at the same time, it can distract them. So you have to be very careful with your trade-off. So what the authors found through the analysis was that narrative visualizations can be placed along a continuum of author-driven and reader-driven approach. So a purely reader-driven approach has no prescribed ordering of images, relies heavily on messages, and it has a high degree of interactivity. I don't know if you're familiar with things like Tableau. These are platform, more like dashboards. You can use them to create some interactive diagrams very quickly. So there is no prescribed ordering of the images there. You leave the user to, by themselves, basically, exploring what you have visualized. A purely author-driven approach, instead, has a very strict linear path through the visualization and relies heavily on messaging and includes no interactivity most of the time. So examples can include instructional videos, for instance, or films of animation. So think about comics. So the nice thing is that most examples of narrative visualizations are hybrid. They fall kind of like somewhere in between the two extremes. And they come up with these three frameworks that are extremely interesting. The first one is the Martini glass structure. So this begins with an author-driven approach where you actually introduce the users to the context of the visualization and the content, and then you open up. You open up to exploration and interactivity. And then you have the interactive slideshow, where you have kind of like boxes. So chunks, the information is chunked in different blocks, but within each block you have some sort of interactivity, so you allow for exploration. And then you have the drill-down story that presents a general theme and allows the user to build their own path and kind of like zoom in and out. And this is very typical, if you don't want to think interactively, this is very typical of posters. But again, even when we talk about posters as designers and information designers, we manage to kind of use the tools to build that narrative in a kind of less or more strict way. And it's all the things that we saw also this morning about the importance of typography and grid and structure and colors. So all this information is extremely relevant and has been extremely relevant because one topic I'm very passionate about is the way we use water. And my interest started in 2007. And since then, I spent a lot of time communicating the same story by building very different narratives. In 2007, in fact, I came across the water footprint research, and through science, I discovered that the world is thirsty because it is hungry. In fact, most of the water that we consume is due to food production. So we think that the water we use is the water that runs through our hands. It is the water we use for drinking, cooking, having a shower. But in technical terms, this is called domestic consumption, and the water footprint network says that amounts to 137 liters of water for me and for each one of you. So this is an amount per capita as a global average. But there is a little problem, because what we consume at home is visible to us, and it's only a very small part of what we use in total. There are two invisible components. The first invisible part is the water we use for the production of the industrial products that we use, like paper and cotton and clothes. And this amounts to 167 liters per person every day. But the big elephant in the room is the water that is used to produce the food we consume every day. And that amounts per capita to 3,496 liters. Meaning that 92% of the water we use is invisible, and it is hidden in our food. So saving water at home is very important, but it's even more important to start looking at what we eat, how we consume what we eat, and how we waste what we eat. So I decided to spend 12 months of my life on this research and to do an MA thesis when I was doing the MA in Information Design at Central St. Martin's. So I used diagrams, and I designed a 900 pages books, and I made maps and models, and I started collaborating with the scientists at the Water Footprint Network in the Netherlands. This is Professor Tony Allen the inventor of virtual water. And I discovered that when you want to communicate science, the most important thing is to collaborate with scientists, because you can actually communicate very false myths, and you can miscommunicate rather than communicating. So the collaboration with the scientists is the key part of the process. And one of the results of the project was that I started giving talks, and I was playing with words and images, and I was exploring verbal communication. I was exploring the use of videos, the use of physical diagrams. And this exploration was very useful, because I had a cause, and I wanted to reach as many people as possible. And I got invited on national TV in Italy, and the invitation sounded like, as long as you can entertain with all your images, you can talk about everything you want. And they gave me 10 minutes free on national TV at 8:30. And you kind of like understand the power of TV. If you have a cause, you can reach millions in 10 minutes. And that was amazing. And I talked about virtual water on TV, like virtual water. So I started writing about it, bridging between two major water scientists to communicate scientific knowledge in words that lay people could relate to. And it took us 3 weeks, this is very recent, to agree on how to build a story around two basic numbers. And in the process, I've discovered that data, of course, has a degree of uncertainty. And it is about the trade-off between accuracy and clarity. That trade-off needs a lot of courage. But it is worth it. So I remember that at the end of the 3 weeks that took me actually to write this article, I had a major water scientist that told me, "Dear Angela, I'm sorry you have had such a drama with your piece. On reflection, and after this struggle to find categories that satisfy the needs of the person in the street, as well as critical scientists, I sense that my good intent, namely to emphasize water for food production, worries critical scientists. They prioritize the quality of categories and tidy statistics, which are the outcome of agreeing to look no further, against whether knowledge can be effectively conveyed and behavior changed." So sometimes reaching this trade-off takes courage, and not all the researchers and scientists want to go public and communicate that science. So it's very important to have communicators and to collaborate with communicators to build together effective communications. So I built the installation. This was for Slow Food International. It was like a 10 meters infographic that allowed hundreds of people to gather around and just walk around and explore, okay, vegetables are here, and meat is here, and coffee is there. And then, after a while, I decided that it was the time to build a digital narrative. And I came across this piece by slaveryfootprint.org, and this was 5 years ago. It was the very first experience of parallaxes. Parallax is this type of website where you scroll down with your mouse and you have things happening on the screen. And the only thing you have to do is just scrolling down. And I thought, wow, that's a very interesting approach. It's a very different way of building a narrative. So that type of narrative where the only thing you can do is to scroll down with your mouse and things happen is very close to the author-driven narrative, right? You don't have a lot of interactivity. But again, it is author-driven, but it opens up to some magic. Because sometimes, if you plan narrative extremely well and accurately, you have this very strong, you can achieve a very strong engagement. So I wanted to add that touch of digital magic to the story. So I started by writing a draft of the story, which was basically the essence of 5 years of talks and conferences. And I wrote about 15, 20 versions in the span of several months. And in this process, I was supervised by a science editor. And version after version, I felt I was kind of like reaching the simplicity I wanted. Now, while I made the process in the editing adventure, the visual narrative was taking shape in my head, and the design began. And this is another very interesting thing. As a designer, writing as a designer is a very good training, because when you write to visualize, you write for people to see something. You are not writing for people to read. And this is very important. So the words to me have a different meaning and a different value, because I know that they have to become images. But at the same time, I wanted people to focus on the content and on the words. And the popular quote that a picture is worth 1,000 words is very true. But I would also say that a picture can be worth a lot of confusion. So it's extremely important to make sure that you build the narrative and the right balance between words and images, so the images don't confuse, but rather enhance what you're trying to communicate. So at a certain point, the storyboard and the graphics and everything was ready, and I collaborated with a team of developers to make all the kind of like scrolling and moving happening. And again, if you collaborate with developers, they have to be very patient ones, because I had Tom as a design advisor, and I was like, can you move 1 pixel left, 1 pixel right, 1 pixel up, and you need very patient people. So the communication with them, and usually in any type of communication, either I work with scientists, either I work with developers, the communication with them is very important. Using data visualization and visual tools to communicate within the team is extremely valuable, and that's what I was doing when I was sharing the storyboarding of the piece. So what happened was that, this is the kind of like a screenshot of how the visualization statically looked like. I was very conscious about the number of words I was using, the balance between the words and the images, and where the peak of the story was. So the peak of the story is here when I tell people that 92% of the water we use is actually for food production. But then see how long it takes me to cut them off the story, or better, to walk them down out of the story, giving them some important takeaways. And actually, the takeaways is the most remembered bit. So of all the feedback that I had from people, the takeaways were most of the time the things that they were thanking for. And the feedback I received has been amazing. When I launched this piece, this was completely self-initiated, no funds at all. And I was like on the edge of almost a breakdown. And then I launched the piece, and after 24 hours it was picked by major newspapers and loads of traffic, and an extremely overwhelming reaction by people saying, I got it. I want to become vegetarian. I want to use this tool to teach kids. I want to use this tool to make exhibitions. And I received loads of emails. And some of them were very interesting, like this one, that says, Dear Angela, congratulations to your wonderful infographic, The Water We Eat. It all makes good sense to a young sustainability practitioner like me, but only in the case I assume I was American. In fact, I am German. Now I live in Argentina, and I've recently worked in Barbados, 15th most water-scarce country in the world, and Jordan, 4th most water-scarce country in the world. Having passed this infographic on to a colleague of mine in Amman, I'm not quite sure she can identify with we, because I use we in the infographic. Neither can I, and neither good friends of mine in Barbados, Singapore, Morocco, South Africa. We waste too much water, for sure. Probably Jordan could be a good way of showing how you can live with using 150 cubic meters a year in average. Kind regards, Benedict. Now, Benedict was very right. He was kind of pointing at. He was pointing at the fact that I was using averages. But I was very conscious about it. And I was kind of expecting and looking forward to an email like this one. So this is the average. So this is what I just presented you, okay? The 92%. So a global average. Let's see what happens if I compare the average to the consumption and the pattern in different countries. So this is USA. This is Republic Democratic of Congo. This is Brazil. This is China. This is India. This is Russia, South Africa, Italy, France, Uganda, Norway. So it is true that each country has very different numbers, but my goal was to show that although the numbers are different, the pattern repeats again and again and again. So the 92% is there. And I've learned that it is crucial to think carefully about what to include and what to leave out. And this can be a big struggle. So your audience will wonder why you do what you do, and it is good to have clear in mind the reasons behind what you do. And you can go through the same struggle if you consider every single piece of data in the infographic. There are millions of stories that hide within the data set. Again, what do you keep? What do you leave out? For example, when you tell people it takes 15,400 liters of water to produce 1 kilo of beef, how many stories do hide behind this number? Story number 1, the 15,400 liters can have a different impact according to the way the meat is produced. So, if the cow is raised in an industrial system, the cow eats grains, and the grains have been maybe produced with irrigation that used very precious water pumped from groundwater reservoirs that require hundreds of years to be refilled. If the cow is raised on grass, it eats grass, namely water that is already in the soil. So meat raised on grass is more water sustainable than meat produced in industrial systems. Story number 2, 15,400 liters is an average. In fact, 1 kilo of meat produced in USA requires about 27,000 liters, 6,400 in the Netherlands, 16,000 in India, 19,000 in Brazil. Story number 3, on average, producing meat takes a lot of water, wherever it is produced. So producing meat takes, anyway, much more water than producing fruits and vegetables. Story number 4, the average daily water consumption of a meat-eating person is much higher than the average of a vegetarian. So you have 5,000 liters versus 2,500 liters. So in countries where there is a very strong culture of heavy meat consumption, 1 meat-free a day can make a big difference. So the gist of all this is that there are many potential data stories hidden in your data set. And I usually decide according to what I want people to do with that story. Do I want them to understand? Do I want them to raise awareness? Do I want them to change behavior? So in December 2013, I was approached by an Italian NGO, and they wanted to explore the idea of building a similar narrative. And they had a big problem, the problem of resource grabbing. Because in rich countries, we have large appetites. We cannot fulfill those appetites, and we usually go abroad to buy and to just put our hands on others people's land. So, what happened was that this process is very well researched, very extensively. Data are quite uncertain, and it's the process of land grabbing. And it's usually fed and supported by governments and transnational corporations, and the impact is very harmful because people are displaced and land is taken away from local communities. So initially we studied many different reports, and then after many meetings and research and back and forth in several months, the conclusion was that resource grabbing was not a good hook, because people could not relate to it. And it was happening too far away for a European listener. So But we thought that overconsumption and waste are instead the topic that are very close to us, and we can kind of like relate to it much better. And overconsumption and waste are actually the driver of resource grabbing, because we grab resources abroad because we want to keep fulfilling our needs in rich countries. So we focused on waste. And that's the way I start building structures in the content when I communicate with scientists. They usually come with huge reports, and we go through the information, we distill information, and I try to make them understand what's the process from the words to the visual. So what I do, I take the text, and we do most of our work on the words, and then I start placing the text, and I start building almost like flow charts. And I call this chunking. And you can do that with color coding, and just to make them understand how the flow is going to be constructed. So we focused on food waste, and we decided to focus only on the FAO reports, just to avoid inconsistencies in the data. And the hardest part was to find the right words to evoke the beauty of natural resources. Now, initially, the researchers were the ones who were supposed to write the story. And they gave up. They told me, we don't manage. We know it all, we don't manage. So the role changed. So I became suddenly also the editor of the story. Here again, I had a design advisor, I had an editing advisor, and I started writing the story. And I wanted to be extremely evocative. I wanted to communicate the emotional aspect of food. So very quickly, the data communicated there are these ones. FAO estimates that of all the food produced for human consumption in the world every year, 1/3 doesn't reach our stomach. And that equals 1.6 billion tons of food every year. 80% of that is edible food, is food we can eat. So food is wasted through all the stages of the supply chain, in agricultural production, in post-harvesting and storage, industrial processing, distribution and retail, consumption. Now, there is a specific pattern when you see how food waste happen along the supply chain, because you have that 32% happens in the agricultural production, 22%, 355 million of tons in the post-harvesting and storage, 11% industrial processing, 13%, 200 millions in the distribution and retail, and 22%, 345 million tons of food wasted every year there, and that's us. So there is an important story here. There was a very interesting pattern, because we discovered that in the most affluent societies, volumes of wastage are big in downstream phases of the supply chain, because we kind of don't care. We have loads of inconsistency throughout the supply chains. We have different stakeholders that they don't talk to each other. Whereas in countries like low-income countries, for instance, the waste happens because their refrigeration capacity is very low, okay? So there is also a very different ethical consequence of this waste. But we decided to focus there, because that's us, and we can do something about this. And, and Benedict probably saw this new infographic, I hope, because here we cannot use averages, because the data are so different between different areas of the world that it was important to show the data in the different areas of the world. So this is what happened in different world regions per capita every year. 6 kilos per person wasted every year in sub-Saharan Africa, 11 in South and Southeast Asia, 25 Latin America, North Africa, Western and Central Asia, 33, 73 industrialized Asia, 95 Europe, 115 North America and Oceania. Now, the interesting thing is that if we go back to Europe for a second, actually about 60% of it can be avoided. meaning that 57 kilos of waste can be avoided every year. And that means that from tomorrow, without waiting for any law to be passed, we can cut 60% of our waste. So that was the peak of the story. And we launched last year. And again, it was extremely well received. It was very different, more word-based, and you can look at it at foodisforeating.org. Now, just to conclude, I want to say that during the past 7 years, I've learned definitely that an image can trap the data in a visualization that is very tidy and precise, and pretty and fixed, and doesn't communicate uncertainty. And we designers can be very good at achieving very clean and neat visual statements. But data is a product of a complex reality. They hold a complex story and many, many truths. So through the channel, of course, of beauty and cognition and perceptions, and through the dialogue with the scientists and with the audiences, and by understanding the content and the mission of our piece, information design allows us to build the right narrative and to understand what you have to include and what you have to leave out. Thank you very much. I guess that there is time for questions. Maybe.
If there's no questions, then we don't need them.
Does anybody have any question? Don't be shy. Yes.
Is that working? Yeah. It was more of a comment, really. I just really enjoyed, well, I've enjoyed the whole thing, thank you very much, but I particularly enjoyed seeing the last presentation and the visualization of supply chain, which is directly relevant to something I'm working on at the moment, and I've struggled to imagine, or I mean, even though I'm from a farming background, I found it difficult to visualize and understand that. So it impressed upon me how important it is to see things visualized in that way.
And I have constant aha moment in my work. I was actually working 2 days ago with one of the researchers at the Norwegian Knowledge Centre for Health Services. This is just to show how what I showed this morning, that why visualizations work and why they can be so powerful. Because we are wired for spotting patterns and recognizing patterns, right? Like back 48 hours. So we are building now the trial for it's a data visualization piece that communicates medical evidence to doctors and patients and policymakers, and the trial is extremely complicated. And the researcher working on the trial was just like all over. It was insane. We were supposed to have a meeting with the developers, and we were envisioning how the hell do we explain this. And then I made a diagram, and the researcher was like, oh my God, I suddenly see it. And I kind of like, I've always understood it. I've been working on this for a year. And then she said, but having the diagram there that I can use for my own understanding and for communicating to other people is extremely powerful. And this type of process, it was like also what Tom was showing this morning. So we do a lot of visualizations, not just for communicating to the target audience, but also for our own understanding. So many times, what I used in the final visualization is exactly the same stuff I go through to visualize stuff for myself and to understand the content. Yeah, so it's very relevant. It's very useful. Yeah.
One thing I was wondering about is when you approach a new data set, for example, what's the first thing you do?
Okay, so I give you an example of a project that I keep talking about in the past days, and I mentioned this morning, which is a kind of not a quantitative data set, but it's a qualitative data set. So actually, there is a distinction. If it is a project like the virtual water research, when I went through the virtual water research, I didn't have anybody telling me, you know, Angela, you should look at this because 92% of the food, of the water we use is for food production. I kind of like discovered it through the United Nations report, 600 pages report. And then I went through the research and I thought, oh my God, I mean, you know, are you serious? There are people spending investing multi-billion campaigns for telling us not to let water running while we have a shower, which is very important, and nobody's telling us that the 92% is there. We must talk about it. And I actually got in touch with the scientists, and I said, you gotta go out there and tell this to everybody. So, and by talking to them, of course, I understand that 92%, that's the peak of the story. So I already have the message very clear in my end, and it's about building different narratives to communicate it. So that's one approach. There are other situations where you don't actually know what you want to communicate, but you are very close to a cause. Very close, for example, to climate change right now. And I told you I went to Greenland, and I spent 5 days with scientists, and et cetera, like people with different backgrounds. And one of the things that I discovered after taking care of climate change science for so many years is that I was making an assumption that, it's more like the information deficit approach type of communication. You communicate clearly and beautifully, and people will understand, and everybody's going to be fine, and we will make something out of it, which is not true. So you have to touch values, and you have to touch beliefs sometimes. And at that time, the Pope Francis was launching the encyclical, which is this document that goes around the world. All the Catholic churches has to kind of like align to it. He says climate change exists, period. And people that love Pope Francis and don't know anything about climate change, like my mom, we should do something about climate change. She's never talked about climate change before. It's not even like as popular in Italy, that we have so many problems, like the refugee crisis. And so you understand that there is something there. And I thought, wow, it would be very nice to visualize the encyclical. And, and that's a very big question. How do you visualize the encyclical? And then we get closer to a group of people that are working with the Sustainable Development Goals, the new SDGs. And actually, we realized that the SDGs align with the encyclical perfectly. So the encyclical is highlighting problems, and the SDGs are highlighting the solutions. So we thought, would not be very nice to visualize the SDGs in the encyclical, because Pope Francis is going to New York and he's going to speak at the United Nations, and we are kind of merging the two things. And you start clicking and thinking, wow, that's the message. That's where I want to see the pattern. So at the moment, I'm just recording each SDG throughout the whole text. So you create a framework, and you set a table to record things very accurately. And so I guess that there isn't one way of doing it. It really depends on the message and the target audience and what you want to achieve. Yeah.
No more questions? Okay, thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Angela.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.